Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.
Today we're talking to one of my colleagues from UAB, Dr. Jessie Dunbar, about Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. So it's kind of an obvious contrast between these two writers, especially the excerpts that we're talking about. But I'm particularly interested in how each of them kind of relates to what we're experiencing today, and wonder what your thoughts are about that.
One of the things that keeps coming up in the current political moment is that people keep talking, hearkening back to Martin Luther King, for example, as sort of, but a leader of the Black community, but also this larger kind of persona who is a moral compass for the country, and the conflicting views between, or what appears to be the conflicting views between somebody like Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, in addition to this idea that people invoke somebody like King without understanding the nuance. They ignore his socialist policies, etc. I think that the same is true with regard to Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, and one of the reasons that I'm bringing them up within the context of talking about King as well, is because there was this idea that there was this binary with regard to Black leadership at any given moment. And in this time, it would have been Booker T. and Du Bois. Later, it was Martin Luther King and Malcolm X. So what we end up seeing is that people try to simplify the politics and the agendas of these people to suit a particular, I can't even just say political moment, but a
worldview maybe, or a
worldview, agenda. I mean, there are any number of reasons that people do this. So Booker T. Washington did start off his career being fairly conservative with regard to this idea of, Black people picking themselves up by their bootstraps. And, the students would have read something like this about the Atlanta Compromise speech. What few people know about Booker T. Washington, and I would argue that the same is the case of with somebody like Malcolm X, is that toward the end of his life, he recognized that his policies were being used against the Black community. More specifically, this idea that Black people were supposed to cast down their buckets where they were and continue to do manual labor and not really worry about getting higher learning until they could actually earn some money and become more stable, and then actually attempt to compete with white people. By the end of his life, he realized that this was not working. And what he starts to do, and even before the end of his life, W.E.B. Du Bois's support, the support that he gave to Du Bois, sort of is indicative of the fact that he wasn't oversimplifying this idea. I think he certainly saw that there was a need for both the talented 10th that Du Bois brings into the conversation, and for people who actually really just aren't desirous or prepared to go into higher learning and do these other kinds of vocations. So he starts to fund privately toward the end of his life a number of Black talented 10th thinkers, but also, despite the fact that the Tuskegee machine largely focuses on the A&M, the agricultural and the mechanical, the man did open up Black colleges. So this oversimplification of his legacy is really, really very troubling. I didn't give much airtime to W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois was equally disconcerted by the end of his life, which is why he leaves and moves to Ghana. And so what I see this political moment, or what we could learn from that political moment in this one, is one, there is no one singular answer. I mean, both of these men were on extreme ends of the spectrum, and both of them were extremely disappointed with the ideologies that they presented.
I mean, I think that's exactly the kind of stuff that, my students need to be thinking about when they read these pieces.
The first thing that they need to focus on is the fact that the goal was the same.
Right.
The goal was full inclusion and equality. The fact that we in history and actually sometimes in the current milieu place these as polar opposites while forgetting that they're both people who want the same thing is part of the problem.
Is there anything else that stands out about these excerpts that we're talking about that that you think we should touch on?
Yeah, I think that it's really important to understand that Booker T. Washington is brilliant. Um, and whether or not you believe in his politics, when we think about reading speeches and rhetorical strategies, if you read very, very, very carefully, this man is actually doing something of a radical thing. He pretends to be asking white people permission to tell them how to conduct their business, but he's not. He's telling them. So the first
Right.
half is, Black people cast down your buckets where you are. There's no asking for permission. This is where we are. This is what it is. Then with white people, he's like, if you would allow me to, and then he gives kind of what he perceives to be solutions to white people for this issue of integration. And that was a brilliant tactic, right? To pretend that you're actually being deferential. And quite frankly, what ended up happening was he became rich. He actually did benefit from these policies. It was brilliant on a personal level. It was brilliant in terms of his rhetorical approach. It was flawed in the long run, yes. I think that we also need to think about how important his use of metaphor is. He comes up with myriad ways to describe segregation. And this is also, you have to bear in mind that this man was enslaved. So when you think about just how remarkable it was for him to even write a speech, whether you agree with it or not, having been enslaved and not having access to education.
Right, and that's in contrast with Du Bois, who was not born into slavery, right?
No,
and
he was
and was formally educated
at Harvard, one of the first.
Yeah.
And so, the leaps and bounds of progress that are made, I think one of the areas of focus should be obviously on what he's saying and whether or not you agree with it, but also to bear in mind what was happening in that moment and the bravery that it would have taken for a former slave to stand up in front of a crowd of white people and tell them what to do.
Yeah.
Yes, in Atlanta, and tell them what to do. And then also think about the man himself and what he actually did manage to accomplish in his lifetime, considering his starting conditions. These are really, really important things to think about when we're thinking about these. Obviously, from a present day point of view, we have issues with much of what I have issues with Du Bois's talented 10th at this point.
Yeah.
Just as I have a problem with Booker T. Washington's, separate as the five fingers, but united as the hand or fist.
Yeah, the talented 10th seems kind of like an arbitrary number.
Absolutely, it is. It's an arbitrary number, and it completely and totally I don't know that he would believe that his parents, who actually helped him obviously get into Harvard, educated him enough to be able to get into Harvard, if he would have thought that they were part of the talented 10th, despite the fact that they didn't have access to formal education. I think that the talented 10th sort of undermines everything that Du Bois was trying to argue, which is to say that African-American people are intelligent. African-American people can go head to head with people of any other race or any other country. But then to say that there's only 10% of us, and to not account for the fact that he's saying that specifically because systemically Black people haven't not had that access is, I think, a huge flaw in that particular essay. And I also think that it's elitist and sort of presupposes that we're all supposed to, that there is no way that a person who is not getting formal education can possibly be at the top of the mountain and coming down to pull other people up, that it's only them who can do that. I mean, these are things that we have to think about, but most people readily align themselves with Du Bois. I think in some ways, both of them I think Booker T was a bit more aware of this. I don't think that Du Bois was as aware of it, but both of them fed into white supremacist politics in their own ways. In any case, I do think that despite the fact that we don't agree with everything that any one of these people, I don't know that you're going to read anything that's a highly political statement that you're going to agree with 100%, unless you aren't doing any critical thinking whatsoever.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that there isn't a place for these varied opinions, that these discussions absolutely have to happen. And I believe that they happen so that we can figure out exactly where we fit on the spectrum, and that you can add your own voice into this conversation.
But I think this has been a good conversation that my students will benefit from listening to. So, thank you so much for your time today.
No, thank you.
Literate Discussions with M. David Hornbuckle.